Hello everyone, and I hope you're having a wonderful day. Today we're going to follow the heartwarming story of Trieu Duong and his baby girl, Truc Lam. One quiet morning, as his little daughter begins to grow bigger each day, Trieu Duong realizes she needs a safer and more comfortable place to sleep. So instead of buying one, he decides to build a wooden cradle with his own hands, using simple tools and the woodworking skills he learned from his father. Will he be able to finish it in time for Truc Lam's peaceful nap? Let's discover this beautiful moment of fatherhood together. And if you enjoy this kind of story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next videos. Early in the morning, when the sky was still soft and quiet before the sun fully rose, Trieu Duong slowly woke up to a small movement beside him. Baby Truc Lam was beginning to stir, her tiny body shifting gently as she came out of her sleep. The room was calm and silent, except for the faint sounds of birds outside and the light rustling of the blanket. Trieu Duong opened his eyes immediately when he noticed her moving. Even though he had only slept a few hours, the moment he heard her, he was fully awake. He leaned closer and looked at her face. Truc Lam's eyes were still half closed, but she was making those familiar little sounds that meant she was hungry. Trieu Duong smiled softly. Every morning had started like this lately, and although he was still getting used to being a father, these small routines had become a very meaningful part of his life. Carefully, he lifted Truc Lam into his arms. Her body was warm and light, and she rested comfortably against his chest. He gently supported her head with one hand as he stood up and walked toward the small kitchen area of the house. His movements were slow and quiet, trying not to disturb her more than necessary. He began preparing a bottle of warm milk. First, he heated the water, checking the temperature with careful attention. Then he mixed the milk slowly, making sure everything was just right. When he first started caring for Truc Lam, he often worried about whether the milk was too hot or too cold. But over time, he had learned through experience. Now his hands moved with more confidence, though he still double-checked every step. Holding Truc Lam in one arm, he gently brought the bottle to her mouth. She immediately began drinking, slowly and steadily. Trieu Duong watched her carefully while she drank, adjusting the bottle whenever necessary. Sometimes she would pause, and he would wait patiently until she was ready again. There was no rush in that quiet morning. The house felt peaceful, almost like time had slowed down. Trieu Duong quietly whispered to her as she drank, even though he knew she could barely understand the words. For him, it was simply a way of sharing the moment. After finishing the milk, Truc Lam relaxed against his shoulder. Trieu Duong lightly patted her back, helping her burp. He walked slowly around the room, gently rocking her as he did. A few moments later, she let out a small burp, and he smiled with relief. Little by little, Truc Lam began to fall asleep again. Her breathing became softer, and her small hands slowly relaxed. Trieu Duong stood there for a while, simply holding her. Looking down at her peaceful face always made him feel calm. It reminded him that everything he was doing now had a purpose. Once he was sure she had fallen back into a deep sleep, he carefully laid her down on the soft bedding. He adjusted the blanket and stayed beside her for a moment, watching quietly to make sure she was comfortable. With Truc Lam sleeping peacefully again, Trieu Duong finally sat down nearby. The morning light had begun to enter the room, and the gentle brightness made the house feel warm and calm. As he looked at Truc Lam sleeping, a thought slowly formed in his mind. She was growing. Day by day, he could see small changes in her. She was moving more, reacting more, and needing more space to sleep comfortably. The place where she slept now had worked before, but soon it might not be enough. If she continued growing like this, she would need something safer and stronger. Trieu Duong thought quietly for a while. What Truc Lam needed now was a proper cradle, something sturdy where she could sleep peacefully and safely. After thinking about it for a few minutes, he made a decision. He would build one himself. Buying a cradle might have been easier, but that idea didn't feel right to him. He wanted to create something with his own hands, something simple but strong, something made especially for Truc Lam. The thought of making a wooden cradle felt meaningful. It would not only be a place for her to sleep, but also something that carried the care and effort of a father. Trieu Duong stood up quietly and walked outside into the backyard. The morning air was fresh and cool. Dew still rested on the leaves in the garden, and the ground smelled of damp earth. The sun was slowly rising, bringing soft, golden light across the yard. Near the garden were several pieces of wood that Trieu Duong had collected earlier. Some were too curved or too small, but a few looked straight and solid. He began examining them carefully, lifting each one and checking its shape. He needed pieces that were strong and straight so the cradle would be stable. After a few minutes of searching, he selected several logs that looked suitable. One by one, he carried them toward the working area near the house. The wood was a little heavy, but he didn't mind. He was already imagining how these rough pieces would slowly turn into a cradle for Truc Lam. Before starting his work, he walked back inside to check on her again. She was still sleeping peacefully. Satisfied, he returned to the yard and began working. First, he measured the wood carefully and marked the parts he needed to cut. Using a saw, he started cutting the logs into smaller pieces. The steady sound of the saw echoed gently through the quiet morning. Sawdust slowly fell to the ground as he worked. Each cut was made slowly and carefully. He wanted every piece to be even and balanced. But even while working, Trieu Duong remained attentive. Every few minutes he would pause and look toward the house, listening closely. If he thought he heard any movement from Truc Lam, he would stop immediately to check on her. For him, building the cradle was important, but Truc Lam always came first. Once the wood pieces were cut, he began removing the rough outer bark. Using a small knife, he carefully peeled and shaved the wood until the clean surface underneath was revealed. The work required patience, but Trieu Duong didn't mind. In fact, he felt a certain calm while working with his hands like this. As he continued shaping the wood, memories of his father slowly came back to him. When he was younger, his father often worked with wood as well. Back then, Trieu Duong had watched him carefully measure, cut, and shape wooden tools and furniture. At the time, he didn't realize how valuable those lessons would become. But now, standing in his own yard and building something for his daughter, those memories felt very meaningful. He remembered the patience his father had always shown when working, and now he found himself doing the same. Each wooden piece was slowly smoothed with careful sanding. Trieu Duong ran his hands along the surface to check for rough spots or splinters. He wanted every part of the cradle to feel smooth and safe. Little by little, the pieces began to take shape. The simple wooden boards that had once been rough logs were now becoming parts of something useful. As the sun rose higher in the sky, Trieu Duong continued working steadily, focused and patient. The cradle was slowly beginning to come together. By the time the sun had risen higher in the sky, Trieu Duong had already spent several hours working in the yard. The cool air of the early morning had slowly turned warmer, but he continued focusing on the pieces of wood in front of him. One by one, the rough logs he had gathered earlier were turning into clean wooden parts for the cradle. After sanding each piece carefully, he began arranging them on the ground. He placed the longer boards to the sides and the shorter ones across them, slowly visualizing how the cradle frame would come together. Even though the design was simple, he wanted everything to be balanced and secure. Trieu Duong picked up one of the side pieces and checked its surface again. He ran his hand along the wood, making sure there were no sharp edges left. Any rough spot could be dangerous for a baby, so he made sure every piece felt smooth and safe. Before continuing, he paused and looked toward the house again. As always, his first instinct was to check on Truc Lam. He quietly stepped inside and walked to where she was sleeping. The room was still peaceful. Truc Lam was lying exactly where he had placed her earlier, her tiny chest rising and falling gently with each breath. She was sleeping deeply, completely unaware of the work her father was doing outside for her. Trieu Duong smiled softly. Seeing her sleep like that gave him even more motivation to finish the cradle well. He adjusted the blanket slightly to keep her comfortable, then stepped back outside to continue his work. Back in the yard, he began assembling the base of the cradle. Carefully, he positioned the wooden pieces together and aligned the corners. He checked the balance before fastening them together, making sure the frame would stand evenly. The process required patience. Sometimes he had to reposition the pieces slightly to make them fit better. Other times he would step back and look at the frame from a distance to see if everything looked straight. Slowly but steadily, the structure of the cradle started to appear. The two side frames were connected first, forming the main body. Then he added the base support where the mattress would later rest. Each joint was tightened carefully, ensuring the cradle would be strong enough to hold steady. Although the cradle was simple, Trieu Duong focused on every detail. As he worked, he remembered more of the small techniques his father had taught him years ago. His father used to say that good woodworking wasn't about speed, it was about patience and care. Now those words made perfect sense. This cradle wasn't just another project. It was something his daughter would sleep in every day. That thought alone made him work even more carefully. Once the main frame was secured, he began attaching the side rails. These wooden bars would keep Truc Lam safely inside the cradle while still allowing air and light to pass through. Each rail was measured and placed evenly so that the spacing remained consistent. After positioning them, he tightened each one slowly, checking that they were firmly in place. The cradle was beginning to look complete. After finishing the frame, Trieu Duong stepped back and took a moment to examine his work. The shape was simple but sturdy. The wood had a natural color that looked warm under the sunlight, but he wasn't finished yet. He picked up a piece of sandpaper again and began smoothing the cradle once more. Even though he had already sanded the wood earlier, he wanted to make sure there were absolutely no rough areas left. He carefully moved around the cradle, smoothing every edge, every rail, and every corner. His hands moved slowly but confidently, guided by experience and attention. Finally, after several more minutes of sanding and checking, he nodded quietly to himself. The cradle was finished. It wasn't decorated or fancy, but it was strong, smooth, and built with care. More importantly, it was made specifically for Truc Lam. Trieu Duong wiped the sawdust from his hands and took a deep breath. The work had taken most of the morning, but seeing the completed cradle made the effort feel worthwhile. Now it was time to bring it inside. He carefully lifted the cradle and carried it into the house. The wooden frame was not too heavy, but he still moved slowly to avoid bumping it against the doorframe. Inside the house, he placed the cradle near the spot where Truc Lam usually slept. The soft morning light coming through the doorway gently illuminated the wood. Before placing her in it, Trieu Duong made a few final adjustments. He laid down a soft blanket inside the cradle to create a comfortable sleeping space. Then he pressed lightly on the sides and base to test the stability. The cradle remained solid and balanced. Satisfied, he walked over to where Truc Lam was still sleeping. Carefully, he picked her up in his arms again. She stirred slightly but didn't wake. Her small head rested gently against his shoulder as he carried her toward the new cradle. Trieu Duong slowly lowered her into it, supporting her head and back until she was resting comfortably on the blanket. For a brief moment, Truc Lam moved her hands slightly as if adjusting to the new place. Trieu Duong gently touched the side of the cradle and slowly rocked it back and forth. The cradle swayed lightly. Truc Lam settled almost immediately, her breathing returning to its soft rhythm. Trieu Duong stood beside the cradle, continuing to rock it gently. The motion was slow and calming, just enough to keep her comfortable. As he watched her sleep peacefully inside the cradle he had built, a quiet smile appeared on his face. The simple wooden cradle stood there in the middle of the room, holding something far more precious than its weight. For Trieu Duong, this moment meant everything. The hours of cutting, sanding, and assembling were no longer just work. They had turned into something meaningful, a small gift from a father to his daughter. He rested his hand lightly on the edge of the cradle and looked down at Truc Lam one more time. She was sleeping deeply and peacefully, completely relaxed. Seeing her like that filled his heart with warmth. In that quiet moment, Trieu Duong realized something simple but powerful. Being a father didn't mean doing big or complicated things. Sometimes it was just about small actions. Waking up early, preparing milk, checking on her again and again, and building something with his own hands so she could sleep safely. He gently rocked the cradle one last time. Truc Lam remained asleep, calm and comfortable in her new bed. Trieu Duong stood there for a while longer, enjoying the peaceful silence of the room. And with a soft smile, he quietly watched over her. Early one quiet morning, Trieu Duong wakes up when baby Truc Lam begins to stir. He gently prepares warm milk and patiently feeds her while holding her in his arms. After she falls asleep again, he realizes that she is growing quickly and needs a safer and more comfortable place to sleep. Wanting to do something special for his daughter, he decides to build a wooden cradle himself. He goes to the backyard to find straight pieces of wood, carefully cutting and shaping them with patience. While working, he frequently returns to check on Truc Lam to make sure she is still, sleeping peacefully. Using woodworking skills he once learned from his father, he slowly sands and assembles each wooden piece with care. After many hours of focused work, the simple but sturdy cradle is finally finished, and Trieu Duong gently places Truc Lam inside, smiling as she sleeps peacefully.